about culture and how we make it work.
Hi, I'm Carol Watson, and I am host of REfit. And thank you for joining us for a new episode. This first season, we're unpacking layer by layer, what does culture mean? And what does it mean to me, and why should I even care? Ever wonder why it feels difficult to make decisions when you're collaborating with people? Have you ever thought your communication was clear? I said what I said, but our colleague of the team just didn't seem to understand the intention, even though we were speaking the same language. You wonder why, if you had all the same training, the same education and the goals were clear, how could it seem that we're just not achieving the same goals? Well, if you thought that there was a better way to understand different values, behaviors, and ways of working. If you're working outside of your home country, you move to a different place or the country that inform your values and identities, this episode is for you. We are doing this for our community of individual contributors doing work wherever they are. But for the managers in our audience, if you have a team and they're made up of people across different countries and different cultural identities, then yes, we invite you to listen and learn how you can be a better, agile, and amazing leader. And so we want to welcome our guest today, Robyn de Villiers. She's the founder and the CEO of 3 Cs. And a former colleague of mine. She is the founder of Burson Africa, the largest communications agency globally around the world. She's an executive coach and one of only 4 certified Culture Map consultants globally. And Culture Map really builds cultural competence and enables inclusive leadership behaviors when you're working across borders or even within the same country and across cultures. The first phase of her career, Robyn was engaged in public relations, corporate communications, and training across the continent of Africa. Yes, it's a continent, 55 countries, globally, for 30 years. She's a veteran, and she pours her heart out with not only other commerce industries across the continent, but also with young people doing amazing work to make sure that the next generation is supported and doing their best to navigate and thrive across the continent. Now Robyn goes to companies and organizations all over the world, helping them to learn to be more culturally competent, for leaders to be able to learn and listen. So let's begin the conversation. Welcome, Robyn. We've known each other for quite a while, and we've worked in the same places, and many, many stories of that. And that was my introduction to Culture Map and the work that you do so well. But you have many, many different identities and experiences that brought you to where you are now. Can you give us some of the highlights of your career that have kind of informed the work you're doing now?
Yeah, sure. So, I spent the first 32 years, actually a little bit longer than that, of my career in public relations and reputation management. And so I started at my own public relations firm a very long time ago in South Africa. And then after about 2 years, a client asked us if we could do work for them in Nigeria. And I'd never been to Nigeria in my life, and I'd never worked anywhere other than in South Africa. But I thought, well, let me see if there's some way I could do this. And so I went and found local agencies in Nigeria who we partnered with. It was a big project for the World Health Organization. So we partnered with a local Nigerian agency, and it worked really well. I did learn a few things, though, and I learned that some of the things that we thought were the right way to do it from a South African perspective didn't work the same way in Nigeria. So there were a few lessons of, okay, goodness, that's not how we would have set that up or how we would have done that. And it was my first, I guess, inklings of we don't all do things the same way. And it doesn't mean that my way is right and their way is wrong. And I think that's one of the things that's very interesting about culture work, is that we all reframe everybody else's behavior from the perspective of the way we would do it. And we see ours as right and theirs is wrong, which is interesting and something that you learn about when you work with the culture map. But so then going back to the business, we then had other opportunities to work with clients in other countries in Africa other than South Africa. And so over many years, we built the biggest PR network across Africa. So that meant that I traveled and worked in 54 different countries on the continent. And I've been to many of them lots of times. And I have friends and colleagues all over Africa. And one of the things I realized right at the beginning of that, developing the Africa network, was that I couldn't guarantee that I would be able to give them business. And so my team and I were thinking about what could we offer them that would be really valuable to them so that they would want to partner with us. If we couldn't say, and then we'll give you another client, we'll give you another client, because that depended on the client's requirements. And so through asking them what they thought would be valuable, what we realized right up front was that they had a strong sense that the South African PR market was more developed than theirs. And so they wanted skills transfer and uplifting their people from a skills perspective. And so we created a training academy, which I ran for all the 30-something years that I ran the business. And the training academy has trained PR professionals all across Africa for many, many years, and it still continues today. We also created an internship program called Starting Blocks, which still continues. And I still am a lecturer in Starting Blocks, which is wonderful because we've trained lots of young people. And what we did with Starting Blocks when we made it across the continent was to make sure that we put people from different countries into teams together so that they didn't only have to do the PR work, they also had to learn how to work across cultures. And they all comment on the fact that it was so valuable to work with people who came from other cultures. And I guess that was the beginning of me being interested in the cross-cultural work that I do today.
It's so fascinating, and we're going to dig into it. But I'm just curious what you noticed, what people commented on across the continent, because so many people still think that the African continent is just one country and everything is the same. Can you give us a little taste of what people comment on that is different across countries and on the continent?
So that makes me smile because I always said to people when I was running that business that the thing I said most often when we were being asked by clients across Africa, across the world to do work for them, the question we asked most often was, which countries do you want the work to be done in? Because they would say, could you please launch this product in Africa? Or could you send this press release out in Africa? And we had to keep saying, there are 55 countries in Africa. Which ones are you focusing on? And many times, if they were our PR partners in their offices, they hadn't even thought to ask the client that question. So they couldn't answer. They had to go back to the client to say which country. So what I learned from working across all the different countries is that we have different ways of communicating. So some of us are very, what in the culture map terms is described as low context, which means we're explicit and we're clear and we communicate simply and we repeat ourselves to make sure that people will understand. And our focus is on making sure that if I'm communicating, that I'm responsible for the success of the communication. So I'm going to make sure it's very simple and clear. And if you just listen to me nicely, you'll understand. But then there are many contexts, there are many countries in Africa that would be on the high context end of that scale, which means they don't burden themselves with sole responsibility for the communication being effective. They see it as a two-way street. So I'm communicating, but you're listening, and you have to interpret. You have to read between the lines, because I might not just say it all in words. I might hint at something, and then you need to think about what I'm trying to say or what I'm meaning for you to hear, even if it's not explicit in my words. And you can imagine how there can be confusion or sometimes even conflict when people aren't reading between the lines, but the person who's communicating is assuming that they are. And then you have that situation where people say, I just don't get it. She's not clear. And then somebody else who listened to the same conversation says, but it was perfectly clear. She said this. And then the low context person says, but why didn't she just say that in words? Why didn't she just say that? So there are all sorts of nuances that are really interesting that can cause confusion, but also they have unintended consequences. They can cause insult, for example. So the low context communicator repeats what they're saying and will send an email repeating again what they said in the meeting. And the high context communicator will be offended by that because they have a sense of, you've already said it twice. Why are you telling me again? Don't you trust me? Or maybe they think, do you think I'm stupid that you have to tell it to me again? So there are all sorts of unintended things that go wrong when you don't understand that coming from different cultures means we do things differently.
Yeah, it's so interesting you bring up that example in particular because, everyone can hear that I'm an American, and I had a sales career in previous lives. And one of the trainings of being in sales is that you tell them what you're going to tell them, then you told them what you just told them again.
Yes.
And I didn't realize that it is a Western, very, US way to sell and convince someone of something, and being direct and limiting the explanation is also very, very important. And just even storytelling, how we tell stories, we're all encouraged to do storytelling, whether it's creating content or just selling people on something, but how you tell a story is so culture specific.
Yes.
Way beyond accents.
Oh, no,
and
absolutely.
language.
Yeah. And actually, often what happens that's interesting to see in my culture work is that people make an assumption, and I'm talking specifically here as it relates to the United States and the United Kingdom, is that people make an assumption that because they are both English speaking, that they would be very similar. And actually, if you look at the culture map research, they're not similar. There's some places where they might be, but there are many places where they're not similar at all. And if you're not aware of that, you can have real misunderstandings of me, for example, as a South African. I can misinterpret the American way of saying something and the British way of saying something, and interpret the one as insulting and the other one as cynical or whatever it might be, because I don't understand the differences.
So we're going to get into the book and what Culture Map is, but want to just first learn more about your cultural identities. How do you describe all of your cultural identities and intersections when you're talking to people or meeting with clients?
You mean me personally?
You personally.
So, I am South African by birth, and my parents were South African as well. But then if you go back to the next generation, they weren't necessarily South African. So, for example, my grandfather was British. And my family came from a mixture of British and French Huguenots. And in the South African context, that is a very common thing because South Africa's population came from some from further north in Africa coming downwards, and then some from Portugal, from England, from French Huguenots. There are lots of different, from Dutch. And so mine is a real mixture. And so when I created my culture map, I looked at my family history to say, what would be the closest comparison in terms of maps that have been drawn. And so I compared myself to the United Kingdom based on my family history. So let's say 60% of my blood comes from the British. And it was really interesting when I drew my culture map, or when I created my culture map, is that my pattern is similar to the UK pattern, but the positions aren't the same. So I have it's similar, but not the same. And that you see often with people doing culture work, is that you're similar to your country of origin, if I could call it that, or your culture of origin, but not necessarily the same.
Workforce culture is at the very essence of what we're looking to unpack and explore. And I was very excited to have you early on in this foundational season of Culture REfit, because people often misunderstand what culture is. How do you talk to your participants when you're coaching, when you're talking to clients about culture?
So, for me, maybe I'm being simplistic, but for me, culture it all boils down to one thing, and that is behaviors. So culture isn't those words we put on the pillars when we make, on the posters, when we make a culture program. Although we've all done it, and you and I both coming from a communications background.
Many companies have done it.
Exactly. We've done culture programs, and I've done the communications around culture programs many times. But culture is not those words, and it's culture. It all boils down to the behaviors. Culture comes from leadership in most organizations. It's a trickle down from the top, and it's based on the leaders' behaviors, not what they say, but what they do. And so if you think about it like that, then culture, when people talk about the organizational culture, they're talking about what people do, what you're expected to do, and also what people are allowed to do. And if I look at it from a negative point of view, what people are allowed to get away with. has a negative impact on culture. So if for example, the leaders are hierarchical in nature, and maybe they come from cultures that are hierarchical, then they would trickle down a hierarchical type of culture where the leaders are the leaders and the workers are the workers and they make the decisions, and it would be like that. And as long as everybody understands that and everybody's comfortable with it and it fits in with that culture, then it's okay. But the leaders have to be the example of the behaviors that they want to see from other people. And so we've all seen examples where the leaders say one thing but do another thing, or they tell the staff what they have to do, but they do something completely different. And those are all things that would undermine organizational culture.
Absolutely. I reference the unwritten rules, and this is how we do things here, as a way for people to understand all the different elements and the water that we all swim in, that you don't really even realize is culture.
Yes,
in an organization.
So it really is the way we do things around here is the culture. And often it's not clearly defined. So sometimes the culture is being defined with words and in a certain way, but the way we do things around here doesn't match those words. And so then the culture, there's a misalignment between what you're saying and what you're doing. And, when people, so often you hear people talking about, it wasn't pleasant working there because it was a really toxic culture. When they're talking about a toxic culture, it always relates to behaviors that are not good behaviors, that don't fit into the defined culture, but are still being allowed. So, that's where toxic culture comes from. It comes from, we're all supposed to do it like that, but when people do it like this, they're allowed to do it. And that has a negative impact on other people.
So tell us a little bit about what brings you into an organization. What are they trying to solve for?
So it's a variety of things. On occasions, it's a team building exercise where they're looking for getting a team to collaborate better together, or maybe they've had a restructure, so it's a new group of people working together. And what they think they're doing is really just doing something nice. So, what could you do for a team building exercise? You can go rock climbing, or, you can play paddle or something. But the culture map allows you to do an exercise where you all learn something. You learn about yourself and you learn about each other. So it's real valuable learning, but it's also fun at the same time. And so for me, it's on that one extreme of just a team building exercise. It's a team building exercise that lands real value, that goes beyond we just spend some nice time together. Then we get called in when there are perceived to be problems with how effectively a team is working together, for example. So it could be this team of people just don't communicate well, they're not collaborating well, the output isn't what we need it to be. So can you help us to understand what is going wrong here? And our premise is always that you start with the individual cultures of the team members. So you start by understanding, this is how I do things, and this is how you do things. And rather than me being right and you being wrong, it's just different. So the culture map is a discovery tool. It's not an assessment. It doesn't say this is better than that. It just says, oh, that's interesting. Robyn does it like this. Carol does it like this. They're different. What's the gap? And what do we need to do to work with that gap? Because if the gap is the thing that makes us not work that well together, how do we close that gap? And so sometimes it's team effectiveness. And that would be internal in an organization. Sometimes it's a brand new project with a client, for example. So it's an internal team working with a client team, and they come from different cultures. So I did one recently, a 2-hour workshop with a client that's a big infrastructure development company based in the Netherlands, but working globally. And they were doing a new project with a new client, and altogether there were 16 different cultures in the team members. And they worked out right at the beginning that to make it work well, they needed to understand the cultures so that you can talk about the rules of engagement and create something that's a framework for working that will work for everybody up front, that takes into account the fact that we are different. And so I might do it differently from you, but it doesn't matter as long as we understand that.
Culture Map, one of my favorite books. As you can see, all of my
mine looks like
my
that.
Notes. And I love the line at the front, at the top. Whether you're sitting at a desk in Boston or eating at a restaurant in Beijing, communicating is part of culture. and it's the great challenge of the global economy. Tell us about Culture Map. What is it?
So it's a body of research that goes back more than 20 years that's been done by an American woman called Erin Meyer, who is a professor at the INSEAD Business School in France. So she's worked in culture. She was born and raised in Minnesota. She's worked in culture for many years. And for the last, I'm guessing now, but about 20 years, she's been a professor at the INSEAD Business School, where she runs a course that's part of the INSEAD MBA and the part of the INSEAD leadership training. So I'm going to tell you the name of the course only because it really hits home the message of what this is about. The course is called Leading Across Borders and Cultures, and then it has a subheading, which is Breaking Through the Invisible Barriers to Global Business. And I think that's important because cultural differences are invisible. So we might look different and we can see that, but the way we do things is there, but it's invisible to us. And it's even invisible to ourselves. So Erin's research has so far created 72 country culture maps. So for 72 countries, it's a work in progress. So she's creating more as she goes along, because obviously there are way more than 72 countries in the world. We have 55 in Africa alone. So it's an ongoing project. And what she's done is she's created a country culture map for each of the 72 countries based on thousands and thousands of interviews, and they're focused on specific business behaviors. So she focuses on 8, what she calls dimensions or business behaviors. They're all things that we do at work, and we can go into more detail on those. So what she's done is she's created the country culture maps, and then she's created an online tool that allows you and I to go into the system and answer a questionnaire and create our own one. So you can see where your country lies, if it's one of the 72 that's mapped already, and you can create your own map. So you see where you lie on those behaviors. And then she's also created a team mapping tool that allows us to work with the team and see how they all are relative to each other. And then last, the newest tool is the tool that she created in a big project she did with Netflix, where they looked at the organizational map. So the organizational culture of Netflix defined across those same 8 behaviors. And so now there's an organizational mapping tool as well that allows you to, I guess, to start off with is to say, where are we now in terms of the way we do things around here? And once you've drawn it and created it, you can then look at it and say, well, is that really what we meant to create, or is this an accident that's happened? And then you can say, this is actually what we want it to be. And you can work out then what you need to do to get from point A to point B.
So we're going to get a little taste. We can't go too deep in this short period of time, but we're going to get a little taste of the 8 behaviors. I think what was important in this conversation to bring up is that, you know, we all have been informed by different countries and different values, and even within a country, we may feel pulled in a different direction than what it shows as our value system, but it helps us to learn more about who we are and what makes us feel like we fit in, what makes us feel like we don't fit into an organization or to a team.
Yeah.
It might be the leader that you have that has a different approach, a different value than even the organization itself. So there are 8. We're going to share with our audience what the 8 are, but tell us one of your big favorites. Let's start with where you want to start out the 8 behaviors, and what does that mean?
So the first one is communicating, and I told you a little bit about that earlier when I spoke about low context, very simple and clear, and high context, much more nuanced, and you have to read between the lines and do some work to interpret. Communicating is fundamental because at the end of the day, we do everything we do at work through communicating. And so I think that one is critically important. And the differences are things that you can't see, but you feel. You can feel that there's something that's not working properly. You don't really know what it is. So it really helps you to understand that. And then I think there are 2 that I think are critically important to be successful in a team or in a business. A second one would be what's called evaluating, which is the dimension that focuses on giving effective feedback. And I think that's a critical thing in organizations, is that many organizations, the feedback mechanisms are not effective and they're not honest, and people don't get proper feedback. And, it's easy to give somebody positive feedback. And most of us from any culture, we are happy to get positive feedback. But when somebody's helping us with critical feedback, the way that feedback is given is very important. And so I think we, maybe this will make you smile. Many of us were brought up with parents who said, do unto others, treat other people the way you would like to be treated, which I guess is correct in general. But when you come to cross-cultural work, if you treat everybody, so let's say I give everybody feedback the same way I would want to be given feedback. For some people, that will be very effective. But for other people, it won't be effective at all. And if my objective is to make sure that you hear my feedback, especially when I'm having to give critical feedback, the objective is to make sure the person hears it and understands it so they can do something about it. If I had to give it to you in a way that doesn't land with you, then I've just wasted my time, because you're not going to make the changes you need to make. And so many times you hear people saying, but I told him in his performance review and he hasn't done anything about it. And now I've worked out, and now that I've learned about it, I can say, okay, but how did you tell him? Did you tell him the way that suited you? Because he's not the same as you. So you need to understand the difference between direct feedback cultures and indirect feedback cultures. And indirect doesn't mean that you don't give the feedback. You still give the feedback, but you give it in a slightly different way. And that I think is a critical one, because there's so many times conflict in organizations because people are just not understanding the feedback. The third one that I think is critically important, well, there are two more, but I'm going to pick on this one, is what Erin has called the disagreeing dimension, which is about how we debate or how we discuss things at work. So when there's a decision that needs to be made, how do we debate and discuss things? And I think in today's world, where we work with diverse groups of people all the time, understanding how people are comfortable discussing and debating is critical to being able to get proper input from everybody. So I'm sure you'll be able to picture the scene. We've all been in meetings where there's a bit of a discussion and there's a bit of a disagreement, and only half the people in the room are talking. The others are silent. So sometimes you look at them and you think, oh, she hasn't got an opinion, or she never bothers to participate. We tend to be judgmental. But if you understand that some of us are...
That's never me.
Understand that some of us are comfortable with what could look like a fairly confrontational discussion, but others are completely uncomfortable with that. Then you would be able to sense that the people who are keeping quiet are normally the ones who feel as though the temperature in the room has gone up too much. And because they value relationships so much, they rather don't participate. So they exclude themselves from the conversation. And so you never get their input. And we tend to just be judgmental and say, oh, she doesn't even have a point of view. Whereas actually, if you were leading the discussion, what you should be saying, have I made it possible for everybody to share their view?
Yeah, and then you add in introvert versus extrovert to that mix.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it gets a little messy.
Yeah.
So let's kind of unpack and make it real for our audience and give us some examples. So in the assessment, there's a spectrum, and each country falls somewhere on that spectrum. Give us an example in the extremes of the spectrum of in that discussion in the meeting. What would that look like from the extreme countries?
Okay. So if I look at the disagreeing, so the debating, the discussing dimension or behavior, the line for France is very much on the left-hand side. So French people are comfortable with what Erin would define as a confrontational debate. So that they're happy with, and obviously not only France, I'm just giving you an example. They're happy with, we all disagree, we're disagreeing loudly. Some people might be raising their voices. Some people might be thumping their fist on the table. Sometimes people are so passionate they have to stand up because they can't express themselves properly when they're sitting down. And it's a discussion that looks heated to the people who are on the opposite side. So if I give you an example, most of the African countries that have been mapped so far are on the opposite side. They're on the avoids confrontation side. So they will still discuss. And China and Japan, for example, would be very much on the opposite side. They will have the discussion, but it won't be heated. It will be quiet. Everybody will be given an opportunity to say what they want to say, and it will be quiet and subdued, and it won't look like an argument to anybody who's looking in from the outside. But the French one or the Italian one could look like a huge argument. and people might look at it from the opposite perspective and say, oh my goodness, these people are never going to talk to each other again, they're having a big fight. So that those would be different ends of the spectrum. And you can imagine that if you're from the avoids confrontation culture and you're in a room with people who are very comfortable with confrontational, you just won't participate because you can't get in to that conversation and you don't like the sense of temperature that's rising in the room.
And it's, and I don't remember where the US falls in that, but I've been in meetings where people are not comfortable with the debate. And I've been in meetings where it gets heated and you get to the gold of it, especially in the creative agency world, where they're much more heated. So even within a country, within an organization, within a particular industry, there's some variables. I'm curious across the continent because I think about the difference between a Kenya and a Nigeria and seeing the heatedness in Nigeria.
Great example. So I was going to pass a comment on the American culture map. The American culture map, if you had the grid in front of you and the map that Erin has drawn, you would see that the American map starts where communicating is far left. And then it jumps to the middle
and left is what?
Left is low context. So very simple and clear.
Low context.
Communicating. But over the 8 dimensions, it's a very jagged line. It jumps all over the show. It goes past the midline, jumps all over.
Oh, that's the problem.
And the interesting thing is that the human brain assumes that there's a parallel with certain behaviors. So for example, Americans are low context when they talk. It's simple, clear, and explicit. And I'm giving it to you all in words. Just listen to my words. And they'll repeat and make sure that it's very clear. But when it comes to giving feedback, they're not on the left-hand side. They jump more towards the middle. So you've heard of the American feedback sandwich, which is say something positive, then give the critical feedback, then say something nice again. So the line goes like this. And your brain tells you that if they're very clear, they probably give very clear feedback, but they don't. So the jagged lines, there's, like I said, there's no right or wrong, but the jagged lines are often the places where we trip up because we expect it to be, our brain says it will be like this, but it isn't actually. And the African lines, I think there are 15 African countries mapped so far. The African lines all tend to be on the right-hand side on all of the dimensions, and they're not straight, but they're much straighter lines if you were to compare them, except for Nigeria. So Nigeria starts on the right-hand side as high context communication, but then, for example, for evaluating, which is about giving feedback, it jumps right to the other side. And on the disagreeing, the discussion dimension as well, it goes right over to confrontational. And if you've worked with Nigerians, and I've been there many, many times, and I've worked with my own staff and with clients, and I've got friends there, it's absolutely true to form. Because if you're having a debate, the Nigerians will be the loudest ones in the room. They'll stand and they'll pontificate and they'll really push their view, whereas the other African countries would be much quieter. They'll disagree, but they won't disagree in a very loud or even vaguely aggressive manner.
Can you share a little bit around APAC? APAC in the East and the West are two very different cultural preferences, and we see people moving and migrating, which is why we wanted to really encourage this global conversation. People are going to school across the world. They're working across countries. We are collaborating across borders. And the East and West is very dramatic, as well as the Middle East. What are some of the things that pop up?
It's actually pretty interesting. If you draw on the country mapping tool, you can compare up to 8 or 9 countries at a time. And so if you choose, let's say some big Western markets. So say you select the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, a couple of European countries, and you draw their maps. And then you draw some of what, let me call them emerging markets. So Asia Pacific, Africa, South America, and then you draw their lines. What you see is lines on the left and lines on the right. So there's quite a noticeable difference. And the lines on the left are often the jagged ones, and the lines on the right are the much more straight ones. So Asia Pacific, Africa, much more on the right, which means, for example, that if you look at leadership style, the Asian leadership style, so whether it's Chinese, Japanese, Singaporean, Taiwan, Thailand, whatever it might be, their leadership style is a more hierarchical leadership style, where the leader is seen to be somebody who directs from the front, who knows everything, who can answer all of your questions. And that's what people are used to, and that's what they're looking for in terms of leadership. Whereas, let's say the more Western ones move towards the other side, which is egalitarian leadership style, where the leader is seen as a facilitator amongst equals. And if I ask people to line up, sometimes in a workshop, I'll say, line up where you think you land on this dimension. And the people who put themselves on the egalitarian extreme, they absolutely believe that that's the only leadership style that's fair and correct. But the people who put themselves on the hierarchical side, they believe that that's the right way to do it. So there's always this, I'm right, you're wrong. And I think the unintended consequence is always what's so valuable to learn. So let's say, for example, that I'm trying to think of a very egalitarian country. So let's just say the US is not that egalitarian. Actually, it's one of the places where it moves inwards. But let's say, the Netherlands. So the Netherlands would be one of the most egalitarian of all the leadership styles. So let's say I took a Dutch leader and I put him into an office in Thailand. He would naturally want to talk to all his people and get all of their views and get their views before he makes the decision, all of those things. And they would be looking at him and thinking, well, why is he the leader? He's supposed to know these things. Why is he asking me for my opinion? Because they used to lead from the front. The leader leads from the front. The leader directs. And so sometimes your intention of, I'm going to get there and I'm going to get to know everybody, I'm going to treat everybody as equals, it's a good intention, but it has the opposite effect of what you hope it will have. And because they're hierarchical, which means they defer to the leader, they will nod and smile and not disagree with you. And then you'll feel as though it was a great meeting. And then nothing will happen because they weren't actually agreeing with you, but they're not going to say that. So I've actually worked with leaders who have been moved from one country to another, where my coaching has been around culture. And they've had exactly that experience of having to, within a few weeks, working out, hold on a second, everybody seems to agree and everybody seems to look comfortable and cool, but nothing's actually happening here. And then they've had to confide in maybe in one executive in the leadership team and say, okay, explain to me what's going on here. And then that person one-on-one will tell them, you're trying to make everybody equal and you're trying to get us all to participate, but that's making people feel completely disempowered. They feel empowered if you give them direction, not if you let them come up with the answer. It's the opposite of what that person would think. And then many funny stories of people moving from one country to another and doing what they think is right. And it's often that thing of, I would like to be treated like this, so I'm treating you like this. But it turns out to be exactly the wrong thing.
Yeah, it's interesting comparing that to the generational conversations. And I don't know, it might be anecdotal in your training, but even in Asia, how young people want to participate in decisions is evolving and changing. And it's very dramatic, as we know, in the US and many other cultures, about wanting to be more egalitarian and having a strong opinion. The whole fight around remote work is a great example of people creating agency no matter where they are, but it impacts certain countries more than others. People want to listen more than others. What have you seen generationally by country, any emerging trends?
So, Erin is, as I said, this is an ongoing research study. So Erin is forever doing interviews and collecting new data. It's an interesting conversation because when I ask people in culture workshops, they say that I want to be listened to. I need to feel respected. I want to be understood. It's all that, all of that. But when I ask, and then if I say to them, okay, so you're unhappy if the boss makes the decisions, and they might say, yes, we want to participate. When I ask them if that's changed at home, the answer is always no. So it's interesting to me because the inherent culture stays strong at home. And so I think there's some extra demands that are coming in the working environment that they would never say when they're at home. So I just think that's really interesting. Is that, for example, with the African cultures, many of them are hierarchical. So in the home structure, you defer to the oldest person, or to your father, or, there's real deference for the more senior, the older person. And at home, they would never challenge their parents the way they're starting to challenge leaders in the office. So I think it's interesting because there's a shift there. Something's happening. And I think that over time, and with more people working and moving and working in more different places, I think some of the differences, certainly in terms of how people do things at work, I think some of the differences will become less different. They'll become more similar. Because, there's a human thing of we want to fit in as human beings. So I've often said to people, if I went as myself, and let's say I worked in an office in Munich, and I was the only person who wasn't German, in the beginning I would do things the way I'm comfortable doing it, and then I would realize, oh, okay, I'm clearly different. Nobody else does it like that. And because human beings want to fit in, I'd assimilate into the way they do it there. And if you're only there for a short time, when you go back home again, you quickly let go of that and go back to doing it the way you're comfortable. But if you live there for 3 or 4 years, then you might take on, oh, now I am comfortable doing it like this. And we see that with people who have lived and worked for a length of time, not for 2 months or 6 months, but who've been and lived and worked in another country for a significant period of time, or they've studied in America or whatever it might be, they've been there for a couple of years, is that some of they move further away from the country culture line in certain aspects because they've assimilated into a new way of doing things.
And I can't remember if this is one or it's the context of the conversation. Socializing. I speak to so many people that are from or more have a different value system, different behaviors than the culture that they work in, and how a company and a group socializes is very cultural, and the resistance to engage in the social dynamics and how important they are vary by country.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that, and how do you reconcile your misalignment with those social values within an organization?
So, I think that's a really interesting question. And having worked in an office in South Africa, which is a very diverse population, as you would know, we have 12 official languages in South Africa because we have so many different cultures all right here. And so having worked in that environment my whole life, actually, I was very conscious of the social dynamics. And I'm going to say something against myself. In the beginning, I used to feel that it was my responsibility to make sure that everybody mingled and mixed, and that everybody was doing exactly the same thing. And then after a while, I got to realize that if people were comfortable doing it like that, and somebody else was comfortable doing it like that, that was okay, as long as we didn't do something that was offensive or damaging in any way to somebody else. I think I let go of the pressure of feeling as though I had to make everybody comfortable the same way. I let go of it many years ago. And I think that's an important thing. So my concern with businesses is always that if you start off not understanding that I come from one culture and you come from another culture, and that makes us different. If you don't understand that, you try to fit everybody through the same sausage machine. But actually, we're not all going to fit through the same sausage machine comfortably. So some of us might fit very comfortably, but others are really being squished and not feeling comfortable at all. And that's why I love the work with the culture map, because it's making people aware that we aren't all the same. And that's okay. We should let people not all be the same. And that affects the socializing as well, is not to expect everybody to always feel the same and want to do the same and fit the same, because we're not the same.
Yes, very much so. And the visual of the sausage machine will live forever in my mind.
I was going to say,
we're not all going through the sausage machine.
Yeah, and I think that, and maybe it's because of the focus on everybody has to be treated fairly. We want to make sure everybody's treated fairly, but fairly is not the same for everybody. What feels fair to me and what feels fair to you might be different. And so, one of the things we always say at the beginning of Culture Mat workshops is that as individuals at work, each one of us, I'm sure you'd agree with me, wants to feel listened to, respected, and understood. The problem that we've got is that if we come from different cultures, we make an assumption that what makes me feel listened to, respected, and understood is the same for you, but it might not be. And so, we start off feeling like I'm going to treat her the same way I want to be treated. And like I said earlier, in some cases that's perfect, but in other cases it's completely wrong. And you have to have that, you have to be able to start with that awareness. In many organizations, they've never thought about individual cultures. They define a culture and they define the behaviors, if they're good at it. They define the behaviors, but they're defining the behaviors which are saying we are all identical and we're all going to do it this way. So we're all going to show transparency the same way. We're all going to show honesty, trust, whatever it is, the same way. It's not true.
It's not always the right way. I mean, was fascinating to me coming into this work is my parents are Jamaican. I was born in the US. And so you observe US culture, but you're still informed by how you were brought up. So there are so many people that are first generation in different countries and they think, well, I'm born here, so those are my values. But culture, our personal culture, comes also from the things that influence us, what our parents said, what we're exposed to, media, of course. Absolutely. But even if you're born in a different country, you're still influenced and inspired, and what you think is right and wrong is influenced by your family and the mixture of families.
And that's why I sometimes have that conversation with people in my workshops, because Erin's work is focused on how people behave at work. People from different cultures, how we behave on those 8 dimensions at work. But in my experience, how you behave at work is not necessarily very different from how you behave at home. But in some of the conversations I've had, people say, oh no, at home, I would never say that. At home, I would never do that. And it's because maybe at home, it's much more hierarchical. But at work, the team's being run in an egalitarian way. So they've learned how to do that. But when they get home, they go back to their inherent culture, which I think is interesting because I think our inherent cultures are very strong, actually.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we'll be talking a lot about code switching. So one of the things that people have to do is leave part of who they are to come into the workplace, and that takes an emotional toll on people, and it makes them feel like they are not part of this, but they're going to keep their head down and do the work, and we're losing a lot of who they are. So part of cultural refit philosophy is that we need to kind of navigate and be realizing who we are, what we're bringing, what we're working with, and how to navigate between different worlds and discover more of what that is and who we are.
Absolutely. And I think I talk a lot about this, and I work a lot with this in my coaching practice, is that I think one of the most critical things for leaders today is to be aware of who they are, how their culture impacts the way they work and the way they're comfortable doing things, not only so that they can recognize when somebody else is different, but so that they can switch their style if it will be more effective with somebody from another culture. And I've sometimes had people saying, oh, so you saying I must change the way I do it because she's different from me. I'm like, I'm not saying anything. I'm not telling you anything that you have to do. I'm just saying to you, if your objective is to land that message and you're talking to her in a way that doesn't land with her, you're not going to achieve your objective. So what can you do? You can carry on saying the same thing over and over and get nowhere, or you can just switch it up a little bit and say it to her in a way that will land with her. And it's a bit like a realization of, oh, okay, so style switching is a leadership skill that I think leaders all over the world need to develop.
Yes. Yeah, agility. I talk about, not only the resilience to navigate conflict in all of those different aspects, but I think the culture map really builds awareness around agility and being able to maneuver, to navigate in this new world.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's
so
many places.
Yes. So my favorite one, just for the fun of it, because I think it's fascinating, is the time versus relationship spectrum. Because, it feels like the warmer cultures are more relationship oriented and the colder cultures are more time oriented. But what's your perspective and how does that show up in the workplace?
So it's interesting. So when Erin, that's Erin's trusting dimension, and when Erin talks about it, she talks about task orientation and relationship orientation, and it's very interesting because the task orientated people, remember, the focus is at work. So how do you build trust at work? The task orientated people will say, "I trust Robyn because she understood the brief. She delivered on time. She delivered good quality work. I didn't have to check up on her. She's really reliable. You can trust her." The relationship orientated people will give you credit for the fact that you do good work. But if you say, "Does that mean I can trust her?" They'll say, "Oh, I don't know, because I don't know her." Because they focus on the person, getting to know the person. And that's a very interesting one as well, because we were talking earlier about, let's say, the emerging, so Asia Pacific, Africa, the emerging markets are all on the relationship side. And a lot of the Western markets are more towards the task side, the Western countries. And that is a really important thing, because let's just say you were an American business and you want to go and create a joint venture in Kenya. If you go to Kenya for a week and you focus on the work from day one, when you get there, you focus on the work and trying to get things signed and getting sharing documents and things. At the end of the week, you'll have made no progress, and you will feel as though the Kenyans are very difficult and not honest and not being open and not being willing. And they will be looking at you saying, "I'm not sure I want to have a relationship with these people because they don't even find out anything about me. I don't know anything about them." They want the relationship. They want to see the human connection, and the others want to see the work, only focus on the work. So that's a really interesting thing, because it causes massive stumbling blocks. You can imagine that negotiation would go nowhere unless somebody said to them, stop a second, go and have lunch, talk about your families, talk about your history, say how important it is to build a relationship with these people. If you just focus on the paperwork, you're getting nowhere. Such an important.
Yeah, there are so many epic fails of Westerners, going Monday morning and just let's do this.
Yeah.
One of the things that I find interesting is in the spirit of increasing productivity, there is a desire to have shorter and shorter meetings for the task and get the task done. And I've seen people really struggle because it's task,
Absolutely.
and you don't feel productive unless you checked off all of those boxes in the tasks.
Yeah.
And those that I know that are more relationship oriented from different countries are wondering, they're not trusting this process.
Yeah,
they're
absolutely.
not trusting this because there's no, well, why are we not talking about how we're doing and how we're navigating?
Yeah,
What countries are more relationship oriented that are going to struggle with the task?
So the Asian markets, so China, Japan, Thailand, are all relationship orientated, and the African markets are all relationship orientated as well. So I think that that's really interesting, because if you think about where the emerging economies are and where more and more people are going to have to do more and more business, it's often not the ones that are the very Western way of doing things. So I think that is really interesting. If you look at the population of Africa, Africa has, and I don't know the statistics offhand now, but Africa has the biggest youth population in the whole world. And it's a growing population of young people who are going to be educated and be able to do things and play a role globally. Whereas many of the Western economies are aging, contracting, fewer babies, fewer young people, more old people. And so if you just think about that, that'll be such an interesting thing, because the African populations all need relationship focus. So if you just talk to them about the work, they will feel as though you've got a good focus on the work, but they can't trust you. And trust is the underpin, actually, of us getting things done in the world, is we have to actually learn how to trust each other.
The hot topic that people talk about is psychological safety. And within psychological safety, there has to be trust
Absolutely.
and relatedness. And I think we sometimes forget when we say, oh, we need to create a psychologically safe environment, what that really means.
Yeah. So I was working with a leadership team recently where I actually gave them, in the Exco, an organization, and I gave them feedback that came from the learning journey I designed for their extended leadership team of 23 people. And over 2 years, we did different elements of leadership development. And right at the beginning, I asked them a question, and the answer shocked me because the answer showed me that they felt that there was no psychological safety. So when I was giving feedback to the executive team, I said, something that I saw as a real red flag in the beginning was that this group of people don't feel psychologically safe in this organization. And I mean, I know that's not a nice message to hear, but I was giving the feedback.
Not at all.
And I watched the leaders around the table, and there were a couple of them were sort of taking a deep breath and soaking that in. But there were one or two who kept saying, "But give me an example. I need a specific example. What do they mean by that?" I said, "Why do you need a specific example? Isn't it enough to know that your leadership team of 23 people don't feel psychologically safe? It's not because I'm saying you did something or you did something or you did something. I'm just saying in general, they don't feel as though this is a safe place where they can talk and share." It was so interesting to see the defensiveness, and it always came out in give me a detailed example. It's the focus on the task. So what work thing happened that made him feel not safe?
Yeah, the interesting thing with the consulting world is that, they want the data, but they also want the narrative and anecdotal storytelling. But if it's a story that they can't relate to, then it's negated as not valid.
Yeah.
Oh, that's just that one person. Oh, that didn't work.
Yes.
And there's so many stories that people have. But leaders, culture is a living, breathing organism.
Absolutely.
And they feel it's very personal because we talk about it starting from the top.
Yeah.
But so it's hard to see that your baby, your living, breathing organism
Is not what you thought it was.
Not what you thought it was.
Exactly. Actually, it's an interesting exercise. The Culture Maps organizational mapping tool allows you to put people into groups. And then each group discusses the way we do things around here on the 8 dimensions and plots a line for the company. So you can get 10 groups of 10 people to each do it, and you'll get 10 perceptions of the organizational culture. And then there's a tool that allows you to assimilate them so you can get to the one that most represents the actual organizational culture. And so I've often done it with groups of people where I've separated the leadership team, so the exco, the 6 or 8 people on the exco, and let them do it, and then let other groups of people do it. And the exco map very often is what they draw is a line that's very different from what all of their people draw. And then the discussion on how do we get this to a place where everybody agrees this is what it's like. The leaders are often saying, "But I don't understand that. It's just not like that. That's not how we do things." And then you've got 90 people saying, "This is how we perceive it," and 10 people saying, "But that's not what we do here." Yeah. It's really interesting because getting everybody's perception together is such a valuable thing if you can get it done.
Yes. And if people can trust the system, to be honest.
Yeah.
For sure.
And you have to have a growth mindset to have that conversation, because the minute you're in your fixed
definitely
you're defensive, and then everything is it's not like that and I'm not buying that, then you get nowhere.
Exactly. So for our audience, we are talking to people that are individual contributors all over the world, different roles, and hopefully there's some managers and leaders that also want to learn more about themselves and how they contribute. So we're going to leave your bio in the notes so people can find you and learn more about 3Cs, the book Culture Map. Please, pick it up to learn more about who you are and more anecdotal topics. But before I let you go, we have 2 questions that we ask every guest. One is, as a forever student, a global citizen and a forever student of culture, you've been all over the world and you've talked to people across so many different countries. As a student of culture, what question is on your mind now about culture?
So we've touched on it a little bit, and it's a question that is in my mind is, as we have more global mobility and more people moving away from their culture and working, let's call it, in another culture, in a different culture, what is the impact of that going to be? And will it mean that over time we all end up doing things exactly the same way, which would make for the workplace to be a very boring place, I think, if we all become more and more the same? I think it would be terrible. So that's the one, is to what extent will our mobility mean that our differences slowly get taken away? And the other one is that what we spoke about briefly just now about generational change. So what will the impact be of the different generations and how they see working and the way things should be at work? I think those two things will be very interesting to track over time, is what's the impact of those two things on cultures. I think those two.
So the final question is, we always want to get tips, dicas from each of our guests. And as an executive coach, someone that's coached leaders all over and coach groups, what is your favorite tip to share with our audience?
I think that the world is a place where if we listened more, the world would be a better place. So for me, a critical thing is listen more than you speak. Two ears, one mouth, use them in that proportion rather, because I think most of us don't do that. So listen more than you speak and be curious. Stay in your growth mindset, ask questions, and be aware of the fact that your way of doing things is not the only way and it's not necessarily the right way. So be open to, I do it differently, and that's cool as long as we get the result that we want. So I think awareness, I think asking lots of questions, be curious, ask questions. So instead of saying, oh, my Lord, she irritates me because she does it like that and I would never have done that, instead of having that fixed mindset, rather say, oh, I noticed that you did it differently. That's really interesting. Why did you do it like that? And learn something. And maybe you might even decide that her way is better than your way. But you'll only find that out if you're willing to be open-minded and to be curious and to listen.
Yeah, and it makes the world fun. It makes work fun, and it makes a better culture refit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Robyn, for joining us.
It's a great pleasure.
We really enjoyed the conversation. Hopefully we'll have you back. There's so much more to talk about. I could talk to you for hours.
I had fun too. Thank you, Carol. It's a great pleasure.
So we just finished an amazing conversation about Culture Map with our friend Robyn. And it was such a full-packed episode of amazing content around all the different behaviors in different countries and how we all show up. It was so enlightening for me when I discovered where I felt comfortable, where I fit, where my hand use is too much, where my communications need to adjust depending on where I was in the world. And we wanted to really introduce and leave it with you all. So we want to know what you thought, what resonated. We want to know what your reflections were from the conversation. So please follow us on Instagram at Culture Refit. Don't forget to subscribe on our YouTube channel, Culture Refit. Listen to us on Spotify or Apple Podcast or wherever you get your podcast information. Remember to visit our special landing page, culturerefit.com, and you'll see all the information about each episode, our amazing guests, where to find them, where to learn more, and send in your questions, your ideas, your own dicas and comments. Thank you for joining us, and see you next week on the next episode.